So this is my talk today. I'm calling this a new grand compromise in content management, and I think it's very telling that Giannis didn't want me to use a CMS war as title, although I will be covering that content in this context. Just as a quick introduction, as Giannis mentioned, I've been working in the CMS space for a very long time, about 13 years in CMS as an architect and developer, primarily in the Drupal ecosystem, which I know has been a very, very interesting ecosystem to watch over the course of the last couple of years. I've also been, over the last 5 to 6 years, really keeping a very close eye on the CMS market and kind of this new emerging market around DXPs and headless CMSs and all of these new terms that are coming out. I am Senior Director of Product Strategy at Oracle, where I work on Oracle Content and Experience. For those of you who are familiar with the former FatWire or Web Center, Oracle Content Experience is kind of the spiritual successor of those two products. And I'm also the author of a book called Decoupled Drupal in Practice, which is the only book right now that talks about headless CMS use cases with Drupal. At the same time, I also used to work at Gatsby.js, and I also worked at Acquia, which is the Drupal company. And before that, I was working as a technical lead at Time Inc., one of the biggest enterprise users of CMSs today. As I mentioned, I did write this book, Decoupled Drupal in Practice. It's got a foreword by Dries Bijteft, who is the Drupal project lead and Acquia co-founder. And actually, starting just this month, all the way until July 1st, if you are interested in Drupal as a headless CMS or interested in how other CMSs besides your own are thinking about headless CMS issues, it's 20% off right now at springer.com with the code SODrupal. So please feel free to grab a copy. I also lead a team working on an amazing conference. We run a nonprofit, volunteer-run conference every year. It's a community conference about headless CMS, CMS architectures, and the future of CMS architectures. We're going virtual this year because of coronavirus, July 22nd through 23rd, normally in New York City, but we are going virtual. Tickets are only $10 for an incredible array of talks. We've got some amazing sessions about GraphQL, about headless CMSs, about Jamstack, about Drupal and WordPress, about Oracle, many different sessions, and a really nice gathering of a whole bunch of folks who are very much involved in the headless CMS space. So what I wanted to cover today was really about looking at the CMS from a very high level perspective. I've worked as a CMS practitioner in a lot of different regards, not only as a developer or an architect or a solutions provider, but also in the inside as a platform provider, as an agency, as an agency member, and also from the standpoint of the customer. And I wanted to bring together a lot of the insights that I've been gathering from a lot of the conversations I've had with headless CMS users and traditional CMS users over the past couple of years, and really coalesce around this core message of the fact that we are entering a very new era of the CMS. I don't necessarily agree that the CMS as a product is something that will no longer exist as a category, and I'll talk about a little bit of why that is. And I also want to talk about some of the ways in which our current conception of the CMS and our current understanding of the CMS has really become completely dismantled by the changes that we're seeing in the CMS world. Now, those changes and those evolutions that we're seeing in the CMS world are incredibly problematic because they are causing a great deal of tension between the personas that we have to handle within the CMS market. So I'll talk a little bit about how we kind of fix those issues. So on my blog recently, I had a very popular blog post that was actually spread quite far across the CMS space and was mentioned by a lot of folks, and also was seen by a lot of folks. And it really had to do with this notion that the CMS market is changing at a very rapid pace, a pace that is really unprecedented in the market today, a pace that we haven't really seen since the very earliest days of the CMS about 2 to 2.5 decades ago. One of the biggest things that we're seeing is that there's a lot of new upstarts coming into the picture. Whereas we saw a great deal of stability around folks like Episerver, Sitecore, Drupal, Acquia, WordPress, Adobe Experience Manager, and Oracle, some of these really kind of established mainstays in the CMS market, we're now increasingly seeing this influx of players in the market that are very different in terms of their feature sets, in terms of their characteristics, and also in terms of how they're actually talking about their features and their product priorities in the first place. So Contentful, Prismic, Forestry, which also runs the Tina CMS project, Datto CMS, Sanity, Chemical Content, all these new companies that are really emerging on the market today. Graph CMS, for example, just announced a more than $2 million round of funding just earlier this week. These are all CMSs that are challenging our preconceived notion of what a CMS is and are really driving a great deal of innovation and change in this space. But one of the things that you'll notice if you look at some of these CMSs is that a lot of their ideas are things that we've been having and playing around with in the traditional CMS space for a very long time. Think about, for example, custom content modeling in Contentful, which is table stakes these days for traditional CMSs. Think about, for example, the fact that you can do things like editorial workflow actions in Prismic, publish things that you can do in Contentful as well. But these are, once again, editorial workflows that are things that we've enabled for a very long time in the context of Acquia, Sitecore, Episerver, so on and so forth, for many, many years. Now there's this really interesting new category of CMSs emerging, and one of the things that is really interesting is earlier last week I had an opportunity to discuss with a very, very prominent CMS expert in the industry, who I'm sure many of us on this call know. He told me last week that one of the biggest problems with headless CMS and the biggest reason why they're not seeing the level of adoption that a lot of the headless CMS vendors would expect today is the fact that they're built by developers for developers. And one of the really good examples of, I would say, a developer-oriented CMS that does really well to serve that developer audience is Sanity.io. Sanity provides a great deal of customizability, extensibility for the developer in ways that weren't really available to developers in the past. And this is due to a great deal of limitations around how the first kind of state of the CMS was architected. And I'll talk a little bit more about that historical context shortly. So as we all know, those of us who are in the CMS industry and very much immersed in this market, we know that Gartner, for example, earlier this year, decided to retire the WCM Magic Quadrant in favor of this newfangled term called DXP. And I think all of us, or many of us, were scratching our heads thinking, okay, what is this DXP thing? Why is this something that is suddenly coming into the market today? Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, and I want to dig into those in just a little bit. But the other thing that I wanted to call out is that, this is not by any means a new trend in terms of messaging and in terms of kind of the establishment of some of these ideas and new terminology around our market. As early as 2018, my colleague at Oracle, Mark Grannon, who at the time was an analyst at Forrester, said this: the classic era of web content management is at an end. The classic period of WCM is over. And Mark Grannon also shared his vision for what he calls an agile CMS, which is a very, very interesting and developing iteration of what the CMS is meant to be for a variety of different users. So we know that Gartner has chosen this new phrase, digital experience platform, but what does that exactly mean? Because I think one of the things that we know from the CMS over the course of the past 2 decades is that the ways in which we consider what features are most important in the CMS has really diverged. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly here. I wanted to call out, I'm not sure if Dean Barker's on the call here today, but I wanted to call out a quote that Dean wrote that was very interesting in response to this evolution on Gartner's side about the difference between what Dean calls content management and experience management. And what he says is that many systems like Episerver, as well as Oracle Content Experience, as well as Drupal, are going to cover both of these aspects, both content management and experience management. But specifically what Dean does here is very interesting. He calls out headless vendors as being only on the content side. And this got me thinking, what are some of the examples of things that we've seen that reflect exactly that notion of the headless CMS possibly being a bit of an incomplete promise?
So Preston,
yes, go ahead.
Apologies for, I know it's different when you're used to speaking to stadium-sized audiences. And here you're just speaking to a screen, as has become the norm for the last 2 months. I just wanted to say that Dean is here.
Great.
So hello, Dean. Good to have you. Did Preston get you right on that quote?
Preston, was that from a Squirrel Notes?
That was, I think, yeah. Either no. It was from your interview in CMS Wire by Dom Nicastro.
Okay, then I'm going to blame the missing word on Dom and say that my quote was correct. Thank you, Preston, for calling that out. I appreciate that, first of all.
All right, Preston. I hope I didn't get you off the rails, but
no worries at all. No,
sorry. Go ahead, Preston.
And please, if anyone, please don't feel like you're being rude if you want to interrupt at any time. I know this is a very unusual situation. I'm used to being interrupted during presentations like this. So if you want to challenge me on anything and you're just like, wait, I do not agree with this whatsoever, let's stop here. Happy to do that for about 30, 60 seconds, just so that we can have a rich.
And you can also write something on the chat and then we can pick it up. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I wanted to call out, and one of the things I know Dean has seen as well, is I started to compare some of the ways in which the kind of CMS wars, or the ways that we think about the churn and the conflicts in the CMS market, really reflect how the browser wars, the first and second browser wars, actually transpired. We remember, for example, back in decades ago, that Mosaic browser was the core invention that really led to an incredible amount of growth in terms of web usage and in terms of the ability for the web to really become this democratized, open kind of layer for information. One of the really interesting things, by the way, is that I forget who it was, but there was somebody, it was either DHH or some other very prominent person in software who said on Twitter, it was a viral tweet that said, the web browser is the single most important piece of software invented since the beginning of the web, bar none. And I'm inclined to agree, because it is very much a very important facet of the way that we interact with all of the information, and of course, the information age. But one of the interesting things about the first browser war, which Wikipedia says lasted between 1995 and 2002, is that there were two categories of issues that were in vogue. And the first was product packaging. One of the really kind of interesting things that happened is very similar to how America Online decided to package all of their dial-up program installations in the form of a CD and send that out in free mailings all across the United States. That led to an incredible amount of penetration of the market. Microsoft doubtlessly saw this exact same model and said, hey, what if we package every single installation of Microsoft Windows with Internet Explorer and forbid, basically, through attrition, essentially, all of these other browsers that could be introduced into that kind of desktop computer? And that's a really interesting kind of situation that led to Internet Explorer really winning that first browser war. The other thing that happened, though, which I think is a little bit more interesting from the standpoint of how we compare the browser war, the first browser war, to the first CMS war, is that there was this really kind of big war to get to feature completeness. Obviously, in this first browser war, one of the most important considerations for browsers was, how do we enable really nice developer tools? How do we enable things like, let's say, Firebug, which evolved later, but more importantly, things like, how do we provide some of these elements, these HTML APIs and some of these JavaScript APIs that will really distinguish us from the rest of the field? But of course, one of the really kind of great things about that feature completeness kind of trend within that first browser war is that we now have, of course, some of these features that are not really used anymore. None of us uses the blink tag or marquee tag, for example, that Netscape introduced back in those days. So with this first browser war, really what it was about was getting to the point where you had a reasonable feature set that could be in competition with a lot of these other browsers that were beginning to take market share. And as you can see over the course of time, with the introduction of CSS and web standards, a lot of these concerns about how these browsers differentially render certain things has become a moot point. Now, in the second browser war, one of the interesting things is that it's totally a different calculation. One of the biggest things that happened, obviously, was with the fall of Netscape. Netscape decided to open source its browser code, which eventually became Firefox and became the underpinning of one of the largest and most important ecosystems that we have today, the Mozilla ecosystem. Proprietary approaches did still remain, obviously, with Internet Explorer. We had obviously Opera enter the picture. But the more interesting thing, I think, than this open source, closed source distinction, which is really interesting for us from the CMS perspective as well, the more interesting thing for me was the fact that the second browser war from roughly 2004 to 2017, which Chrome won, was really about how to provide that ideal end user experience. Really driving great outcomes in performance, having fast speeds when it comes to page loads, having really good support for DHTML and JavaScript, some of these really newfangled technologies that are now the new differentiator for how people are able to actually interact with a website. So user experience and feature completeness from the second and first browser wars, respectively, are things that are really representative of what I believe to be the trends that we're seeing in the first and second CMS wars as well. And I'll talk a little bit about what that actually means. So let's compare, for example, the first browser war and the first CMS war. Whereas the browsers really focused on feature completeness, having that really compelling feature set, sometimes at the expense of web standards, putting in things like Quarks mode and some of these really non-standard approaches that weren't very well accepted back in those days. That kind of is a really great analog for the kind of feature race that we had in CMSs as well. If you think back to the initial LAMP stack or some of the initial, let's say, second wave CMSs. I'm not talking about necessarily some of the really early CMSs, but if you think about the very early iterations of Drupal and WordPress and some of the PHP-based or sort of Ruby-based kind of CMSs, one of the things you notice is that they are really focused on enabling certain functionality that goes above and beyond some of the other foregoing tools in that era. Many of us remember, for example, PHP BB, some of these message board tools that were predominantly actually the main way to provide a means for users to provide user-generated content into these environments. So the CMS really exploded in this kind of innovation because of custom content modeling, because of this idea of content templating and layout building and all of these things, and especially with the innovation of server-side dynamic behavior, which really drove the growth and success of CMSs like Drupal and WordPress. So this race to implement unique features has also led to some detritus on the side. Obviously, just like the marquee element or the blink element in Netscape, some CMSs also have, let's say, some vestigial elements or vestigial features that are no longer in use. One great example of this is that Drupal, very, very long ago, had what's called the color module, and you could use the color module to change the color scheme of your theme in your CMS. Now, obviously, the color module is still part of the Drupal product, but it's no longer used because obviously many people have very strong opinions about colors. They don't want to just let that be something that's governed by CMS users. And now, one of the things I wanted to call out, obviously, is Drupal, and the previous version of this talk I gave was to a Drupal audience, so I apologize for some of the Drupal-specific information here, but this applies just as validly to WordPress. Some of Drupal's most widely used features and some of the features that are most widely used in other ecosystems in CMS emerged in this time during this kind of first CMS war, where we had custom content modeling. For example, in Drupal, you had CCK, the content construction kit, which allowed for flexible content schema customization for the very first time in Drupal. The equivalent in WordPress is advanced custom fields, which allows this ACF plugin to provide this really amazing series of features that really enrich the CMS beyond a simple blogging or message board tool. We also had, because of the advent of server-side dynamism, this really interesting introduction of custom query builders, which is an incredible piece of functionality that every single CMS now considers to be table stakes. This is just like the views module in Drupal. I believe there's also a similar analog in WordPress called something views as well. And this really allowed for an incredible amount of growth in the CMS market that was very, very important. Now, the second CMS war, in my opinion, has just begun over the last few years. And it's really started with the introduction of some of these decoupled CMS or headless CMS solutions. Some of the earliest kind of arguments in favor of a decoupled architecture for CMSs really came from some very interesting approaches that people were undertaking with actually interpolating JavaScript into existing PHP content management systems. And obviously this really grew independently in a lot of different CMS ecosystems, but in the PHP space, this discussion was happening as early as 2009, 2010 in terms of decoupling the CMS architecture out of the box. And there are also, of course, CMS ecosystems that have always been decoupled internally to some degree. And I'm thinking of Sitecore, of course, especially for that. But the second CMS war is very similar to the second browser war in that we are really focused on the user experience. But there's one really key distinction here between the browser war and the CMS war, and the fact that the CMS is serving a very different audience. When it comes to a web browser, when it comes to Mosaic or Netscape or Internet Explorer, what's really happening there is that you're serving a single user persona. You're serving that single end user who's going to find some information or wants to buy a product or conduct a certain transaction on a website. But with CMS, we don't have that luxury of only thinking about one single user. We actually are one of those rare software markets that really has to focus on a very diverse audience, potentially even a more diverse audience and a more multifaceted audience than even players like Salesforce or CRM. For example, Salesforce CRM or some of the other tools that are out there. CMS is really about bringing together very disparate users with very discrete and distinct needs together into the same bucket. So in the second CMS war, yes, it's very similar to the fact that there's this focus on user experience, but the second CMS war has done an interesting thing in that it's favored certain users over others. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is. So if we compare the second browser war and the second CMS war, one of the biggest things that's really come about is obviously client-side dynamic rendering became a really important part of browser technologies, thanks to DHTML, thanks to jQuery, thanks to JavaScript really becoming a first-class citizen. By the same token, within the CMS market, we're also seeing JavaScript and headless CMS techniques, universal JavaScript, server-side rendering in JavaScript. A lot of these client-side approaches now becoming very much part and parcel of the CMS itself. But that's the other that's where the differences really start, is that the end user experience when it comes to the browser is just one single user experience that you're really worried about. Obviously, there's a developer audience, but they've got a really nice set of tools that are fully immersed into that existing user experience. The CMS, however, doesn't really have that luxury. The CMS has had to contend with a lot of different personas, and it's not just content editors, it's not just marketers, it's not just developers, it's also practitioners that have to deal with a lot of different issues. Compliance officers, people who are auditors, people who are project managers who need to be able to handle workflows, thinking about proofreaders who may need to only look at a preview once and they only need to look at a certain preview with certain privileges. Or I'm thinking also of people who are doing things with, for example, Oracle Process Cloud, where they want to be able to integrate any of these editorial workflows and any of these CMS workflows into an overarching orchestration of larger services. So we have this really big problem right now, which is that CMSs have to deal with a whole lot of different users. And I'm very curious about whether or not a lot of the kinds of CMS use cases that we're talking about today and the ways in which we're talking about CMS today really reflect that reality. The other reality that we're facing today as well, of course, is that we're experiencing this organic explosion in the amount of digital experiences that we now have to serve. Content delivery to a variety of different destinations, content reuse is an incredibly large concern for enterprise organizations the world over. And one of the things that we've seen over the past 5 to 10 years is a veritable Cambrian explosion where we're seeing an incredible growth of diversity in these channels. We're seeing, for example, content now exposed to mobile applications, whether they're built in React Native, a compile to native framework, or natively within an Android or iOS application using those particular low-level languages. We're also seeing more adoption of, let's say, Apple TV or Samsung TV or Roku content displays. I worked with a client during my days in Drupal, where they were working with Samsung TV in order to display content from a Drupal site. So these are very, very pressing concerns. We're talking about wearables as well. Wearable content. How do you really display certain content that's currently trapped in the CMS in the context of a smartwatch? How do you also take that content you've got within your CMS, currently trapped and primarily for that web audience, and make that available in a really compelling way in the form of digital signage, not just for developers to be able to code this kind of application, but also for marketers and content editors to be able to go in here and make edits that they see take effect. But there's also still other things that are happening too. Extended reality is now becoming a very, very important concern. I built some pilot projects over at Acquia related to how to display Drupal content, other CMS content in the context of augmented reality. And of course, my favorite form of user interface today, voice interfaces and conversational interfaces, chatbots. How do you present textual content in a spoken way that still makes sense to users? Do you even have the ability and the luxury to reuse your content at that point? So not only do we see this increasing diversity in the ways in which people want to interact with CMSs that has really come about from the growth of the CMS, we're also seeing this growth in non-web experiences, not static sites, not web applications, not websites, but things that go well outside the confines and the jurisdiction of the web into purviews that have never been part of the web's concerns in the first place. But the problem is that CMSs today, regardless of whether we're talking about headless CMS or not, regardless of whether or not we're talking about legacy CMS or talking about a CMS plus commerce solution, there's a big incongruity right now in content management that is an extremely pressing concern for a lot of different folks in the industry today. I hear this problem surface probably once a week or every 2 weeks during my conversations with customers and partners and people who are in the CMS market. And that is the fact that the CMS today and the CMS as we think of it today is currently really only oriented towards these two channels when it comes to enabling the marketer persona and enabling the content editor persona, and indeed every other CMS persona that doesn't have to do with code. The, of course, problem with this is that any of these other experiences that you want to build as a marketing team or as someone who does not have the luxury of having a developer team, suddenly you're stuck. Because if you want to build a Samsung TV app that takes content from your CMS, you got to call a developer. If you want to build an augmented reality overlay that contains content from your CMS, you got to call a developer. You got to contract an agency. You got to go over and talk to your MarTech team, figure out if that IT team over there has any spare bandwidth to handle some of these concerns. And this is the core conflict in content management today. What I hear every single week is that all of these marketing teams are saying, well, we want to do all this stuff with mobile apps and digital signage and augmented reality, but we can't do it because we can't afford to hire these developer teams. We can't afford to have this be something that we can't ourselves spin up and maintain on our own. So the CMS has always been built on what I call an uneasy alliance or a grand compromise, or this kind of this stress-laden equilibrium between different CMS personas that have very disparate needs, but all share the same tool in order to interact with their content. But the problem today that we face is that not all CMS personas are treated equal anymore. We're seeing, for example, a lot of prestige and a lot of privilege given to developers in headless CMSs, but we're not seeing that same level of privilege necessarily being afforded the marketing teams and the content editors. By the same exact token, however, we're also seeing that same trend occur in the legacy CMS market. If you're looking at folks like Drupal and WordPress and Oracle, Sitecore, some of these folks may not be as well equipped for the developer experiences that are now part and parcel of the expectations that JavaScript developers and application developers have today. So neither of our CMS stories, whether it's a legacy CMS story, traditional CMS story, monolithic CMS story, or a headless CMS, decoupled CMS, Jamstack CMS story, those are two very different narratives that no longer are pointing towards this balance between all of these different personas. And this is the fundamental problem facing us today. About 3 years ago, about 3.5 years ago, I gave a presentation at DrupalCon Vienna, and this graphic generated a lot of commotion in the audience. People were whispering and talking about this under their voices, and it was the first time that they had ever seen an illustration of the fundamental problem facing the future of monolithic and legacy CMSs today, which is that what is better for every single user in the end state in terms of providing that really great experience, that great customer experience that is the whole goal of a CMS. The problem is that what is better for these users today with this growth in channels is not something that's necessarily better for the marketing users and content editors who need to be able to interact with that experience in a rich way. It is, however, very good for developers. Recently, in writing my blog posts about the kind of second CMS war and the coming kinds of battles that we're going to have, I really focused on revising this graphic to this state where we're seeing this not only reaction towards the growth in the number of channels being a forcing function to make developer experiences become a first-class consideration, but now we're also seeing an opposite reaction. One of the things I'm hearing more and more often is that regret from buying a headless CMS and recognizing that a lot of the editorial and marketing features that many of these users and many of these buyers consider to be absolutely essential to what they consider a CMS are no longer available. I spoke, for example, to a customer who had contracted an agency to build them a headless Drupal architecture that serves a React.js-driven front end. One of the things that was really interesting is that at the end of this project, the customer was very happy because they had all sorts of great outcomes when it came to performance. They knew that this was providing a much more interactive user experience, a much more conversion optimized experience for all of their customers coming onto the website. They were seeing less churn. They were seeing a lot less concerns when it came to the ability for them to serve that customer. But 6 months after the project concluded, the agency got a call from the customer, and it was a very angry person on the phone who said, look, I am really happy about the performance and all the interactivity of this new application that you've built for us, and I love what we've done here, but where the heck is my admin menu? How do I get to my admin menu from the context of the front end like I used to be able to? And the simple fact of the matter is that you simply can't explain to this person who has just dropped hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially, or tens of thousands of dollars on a CMS product, that there's just simply no way to access that admin menu unless you're within the CMS. And this is the way in which a lot of the ways in which our expectations have been shaped so far in the CMS market, and the ways in which buyers' expectations have been shaped so far in the CMS market, really endangers how we think about the CMS today and how we conceive of the CMS in the future. So inherent to the idea of the DXP, obviously, is this idea of not just one, but many different digital experiences that you want to serve. But the thing that I have been able to identify, and the thing that I have seen come up time and time again from the headless CMS market, and this is not by any means an indictment of the headless CMS market. I love the developer experience that Contentful, Prismic, Sanity provide. But the problem is that what we're seeing more and more is this trend towards really happy developer teams, but across the same floor of the same office, you're seeing them a very, very unhappy marketer team because they know that content has to look different on every channel, but the marketer and the content editor has absolutely no control over how these channels look beyond the web. Just as the compliance officer or the corporate compliance officer has absolutely no idea how to get to some of these channels beyond the web and conduct their audits in a way that makes sense to them, not to the developer, but to them. So this is where I asked the question in that Vienna presentation about 3 years ago, is the notion of site building, is the notion of visual assembly of these websites and these experiences dead? Because how do you take these content templates and layout components and this perfectly pixel perfect landing page and allow for somebody who's a visual editor or somebody who's a site builder or somebody who's a marketing team member to take this same experience that they have right now with these visual builders and take that into the smartwatch context, take that into the mobile context, take that into the voice context even. Now, there's some very interesting prototypes that have been done in this regard. I've seen, for example, Sanity has done some very interesting work in terms of these things, but the fundamental obstacle is that all of these things still require some involvement of a developer to some degree to solve that black box problem of the code simply not being able to be managed in the context of these marketing and content editing use cases. And this is why I believe, and I believe very strongly, that the Holy Grail of DXP, the Holy Grail of this whole category of products for the users that I'm talking about, not necessarily the other aspects of DXP like DAM or analytics or personalization, but this idea of the marketer who is coming into the CMS with a certain level of expectations that they have established over the course of decades working with CMS is this notion of presentation management. It's exactly the kind of thing that Dean Barker that you mentioned within that article, which is that you can't just treat content as data anymore. Content is something that has never been just about data in the context of the CMS. And we need to make sure that that presentation of that data is something that can still be managed just as gracefully as it was before. So the goal here is that digital experience management, this whole idea of a DXP, if we're going to replace the CMS with a new version of what the CMS is meant to embody, this new DXP or this idea of, let's say, the logical conclusion of the headless CMS where you really restore this balance is about that equilibrium, is about restoring this level of satisfaction and the level of compromise that developer teams and marketer teams had. And there's a really interesting illustration of this as well. When you think about the very early history of some of the PHP-based CMSs like Drupal and WordPress, initially, they really didn't have a very robust theme layer or templating layer. But one of the things that developers realized very quickly is that they were going to keep on serving the role of a webmaster, not just for content, but also for presentation. Because with the CMS, certainly this user could go in and edit some content and see that take shape. But what about some of the other things? What about things like layout? What about navigation menus? What about menu management and some of the things that we know are part and parcel of the CMSs today, and also part and parcel of must-have non-negotiable features that marketing buyers consider today? The answer, of course, is that what Drupal and WordPress did really well was to establish a very graceful compromise between these developers and marketer personas. What they said is, developers, you have to give just a little bit of your flexibility, and we're going to give you a template experience. It's not 100% of what you want, and certainly there are limitations and there's going to be problems, but we'll give you a templating layer that gives you the ability to interact with this code in a way that also means that marketing teams and content editing teams, compliance officers, and project managers can still access all the features and contextual features especially that they've gotten accustomed to over the course of the past few decades. Now, one of the questions I asked at the end of last year at a keynote that I gave to a developer audience in Nagoya and also in Tokyo was this question here, which is that one of the whole reasons why headless CMS has become popular, one of the whole reasons why developers have really adopted new CMS architectures is because they want to establish a cleaner separation of concerns in CMS. And every single CMS has had a sense of a separation of concerns, whether more overtly in the form of Sitecore, let's say, or less overtly and more subtly in the case of more monolithic CMSs like Drupal or WordPress. But I posed this question, and this was another question. This is another slide that got a lot of commotion from the audience in Japan, because this is a very important question. Is the separation of concerns something that we still consider to be the same as it was before? Because in monolithic CMSs, this whole separation of concerns, this architectural software separation of concerns has always been more theoretical than actually physically enforced. Consider, for example, that a lot of these contextual features that people consider part and parcel of their CMS experience, like that admin menu that that client was complaining about, or in-place editing, or contextual links, admin menus, layout buildings, those layout affordances that allow you to drag and drop things across the page. Those are things that are part and parcel to the CMS. And these contextual features, by necessity, blur that line between data and presentation, which is one of the reasons why headless CMSs are not implementing some of these features, because it makes absolutely no sense based on their architecture. But one of the things that we're seeing is that we're seeing this notion of rendering begin to become more distributed. So we're seeing this notion of proudly rendered elsewhere, where no longer is the CMS responsible for doing any of the rendering that is governing that presentation. In fact, now what we're seeing also in terms of enterprise adoption is that headless CMSs are now being used for multiple front ends. I spoke with a very large enterprise client in Japan at the end of last year that is, interestingly enough, because of the limitations of their technical teams, because of their lack of resourcing, what they're having to do is they're rebuilding their entire .com site using a variety of different front ends all at the same time in order to meet certain deadlines that have come down from above. What that means is that they're using the Drupal CMS front end natively within the CMS, but they're also using an Ember front end, an Angular front end, and a React front end according to the same exact design system. Now, we can of course debate about whether or not that's an actually viable approach or a sane approach, but this is a reality that we have to consider, which is that a lot of these enterprise organizations don't have the luxury of just adopting one framework or just having one single front end for their applications. They have multiple brand sites or multiple microsites or multiple considerations that they have to consider. And the other thing that's happening with CMS architectures is that the separation of concerns that was originally the server and client distinction is now moving down stack. It's moving further backwards in the stack, where now we're seeing the separation of concerns become part and parcel of the API. The API that the CMS provides for these other experiences is now that key conduit by which data and presentation is negotiated. What that means, of course, is that we have to think about all of these things in the context of the API and not necessarily in the context of a really graceful templating layer. So whereas in the past we had a separation of concerns between the handling of data versus kind of the presentation of that data, which was very, very much a fungible thing in the traditional CMS, now with the Jamstack architectures, the JavaScript architecture, serverless, what we're seeing now is that the API is now becoming this kind of source of data, but the presentation is now in this wholly separate, this completely disparate location that oftentimes is a black box for some of these CMSs. So how do we help in these situations? One of the things I hear very, very often is regret, buyer's remorse from folks who have gone 100% in that headless CMS direction. They've bought Contentful, they've adopted headless Drupal, but they are really, really suffering because they see the benefits when it comes to performance. They see the benefits when it comes to security. They see the benefits when it comes to customer experience, but they're not seeing the benefits when it comes to their own workflows. But at the same time, how do we also help developers feel left behind, who feel left behind as well? Developers are champing at the bit. They're saying, look, we can't deal with these horrible templating systems and these horrible theme layers and awful kind of compromise that you set a long time ago for us to interact with this in a rich way as well. And what we're seeing is this bifurcation in the CMS market. And I just reemphasized this in a recent blog post about this very schism that we're seeing emerge in the CMS market, where when it comes to marketer-friendly CMSs or content editor-friendly CMSs, or let's say non-developer-friendly CMSs, the monolithic CMS still wins out. It still is something that has a major level of adoption, and its adoption curve is still strong. But we've seen the adoption curve for headless CMS start to flatten a little bit. And I've noticed this in a lot of different conversations that I've had with buyers and various agencies as well. And that's mainly because of the fact that we've seen a lot of that buyer's remorse emerge from these marketing teams. And it's very different from that grand compromise, that equilibrium, that nexus of balance that we found with the historic web-only CMS. And one of the realities we have to face today is that marketing functions in enterprise still hold the purse strings for CMS. You're not going to get $1 million check from a CTO. You're going to get $1 million check from a CMO. And that's one of the important things that is holding back, I believe, the adoption curve for headless CMSs. But I want to stop here momentarily because there's a little bit of an interesting parallel to the ways in which we established this grand compromise in the past. And it was really about this historical precedent that we saw from WYSIWYG. We all remember those tools that people loved to use back in the day, thinking that they could build these really amazing websites that would survive for many years without the need of a webmaster or web developer. Front Page, Dreamweaver. Now, WYSIWYG was great for web design, and it really democratized the ability for a lot of folks who didn't know how to write code to enter into the space, this really amazing space that they had never been able to access before. But when you think about the kind of end period, the last few years of WYSIWYG editing when it came to websites, one of the biggest problems was the distance between web programming and the notion of introducing dynamic HTML, DHTML, and JavaScript and jQuery. That was a diametrically opposed notion from a static kind of website builder in the form of a WYSIWYG editor like Front Page or like Dreamweaver. So these WYSIWYG editors were not really that great for web programming. Of course, I'm not thinking about ActionScript here or Flash here, but for JavaScript, how do you allow for somebody who was using Front Page or Dreamweaver to be able to program, let's say, an application that's really rich for their interactive user experience without the need of a developer? And this really calls into question why it was that this led to a compromise. What happened was these marketer streams never actually died. And we see this in the form of layout builders and site builders and some of the WYSIWYG-like tools that we have in CMS. But the problem is that we have this new kind of categorization of CMSs. Obviously, headless CMSs have pushed away marketers, whereas monolithic CMSs have pushed away developers. And we need to figure out a way to bring back some of the benefits that both of these experiences have in a way that makes sense to both of these sets of users. So we know that tight coupling is no longer the answer for CMS architectures, but that's really raising a lot of existential questions within the CMS market that are really challenging a lot of our preconceived notions about what the CMS as a software solution is. And you're already seeing this borne out in some of the marketing and messaging that, for example, Contentful is issuing. Contentful has moved away from the notion of calling itself a CMS. It's a content platform. It's no longer a CMS. It's kind of a loaded term in Contentful's view. But that really calls into question this notion of, is a CMS something that should just be a tech-agnostic content repository, or is it a conjunct of workflows according to how the CMO thinks about a CMS that provides this gravitational pull around a happy medium for both editorial use cases, both compliance use cases, preview use cases, approval use cases, all these things that editors need to do, scheduling content, publishing content, batch publishing content. How do those things intersect with developer experiences in a way that allows for the CMS to still survive as a cohesive whole? So one of the things that I wanted to state here is that there's really an interesting framework that I think we need to start to apply to all of these different considerations for the CMS persona. And a lot of us already are very aware of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In 1943, Maslow came up with this idea that every single human has a prioritized list of needs that they have, and the most important is having food and water, which is the physiological. You need to be able to survive. Then it's shelter and family and friends and social empathy and social sympathy and social connections. And it ends with kind of this notion that once all of your other needs are covered, you can now begin to do other things like self-actualization. I'm not going to dig into Maslow's theories here, but they've been very influential in the fields of motivational psychology and other social sciences. Now, there is certainly a hierarchy of needs that every single user persona within the CMS has, and these can really run the gamut across a variety of different features. But obviously, it's probably no longer the case that we want to enable things like layout manipulation or true WYSIWYG for a lot of these channels that no longer are things that can exist. And this is where that notion of compromise comes into play. Just as developers had to compromise back in the day with their experiences, JavaScript experiences might have a higher threshold of expectations that these non-developer users have. They might expect to be able to manipulate layout for a JavaScript experience, for example, but they know that that's not going to be something possible or even really that needed for a digital signage experience. Now, these are both very hypothetical. Everyone has their own hierarchy of needs. Everyone has their own pyramids. And this is also complicated by the fact that Maslow's successors, the people who have now been thinking more and more about this problem and the hierarchy of needs, agree that there isn't really a single hierarchy of needs that stays stable over the course of time. Sometimes they get flipped over, sometimes they merge with one another, sometimes they move, sometimes they slant differently, and also sometimes those layers between them actually disappear and needs will actually melt into the same level of priority. When I was a child, I really wanted to become a field geologist because field geologists always seem to have the coolest job. They could travel around, go camping, go backpacking, and analyze the geologic formations and tectonic interactions that led to the landforms that we see today. And there's a branch of geology today called stratigraphy, which is the study of layers and the study of how these layers interact with one another. If we think about the modern conception of how hierarchies of needs have now been considered in the realms of sociology and other kinds of disciplines, this really becomes a major issue because the ways in which we think about these layers is totally different depending on the customer. It could be that it's totally flipped over. Maybe WYSIWYG or maybe layout manipulation is more important than a high fidelity preview in some cases for a particular user or for a particular buyer. Maybe there are certain fusions of these layers together that will allow for this kind of compromise to be reached. But there's another key element of stratigraphy which is very important. And that is really isolating and finding where in that fossil record / geologic record certain large-scale evolutions took place. Stratigraphy is one of those things that we can apply to really find out where is that layer of compromise between developers and marketers that we can get to again. Because I guarantee you that those developers who didn't realize that they were going to be burdened with figuring out this Goldilocks solution for what that compromise looked like, where the developers had to compromise a little bit of their experience and the marketers also had to compromise a little bit of their WYSIWYG experience. What did that compromise look like? In their heads, they were probably doing something related to this, where they were thinking, look, okay, I don't need to have full control over every single, let's say, variable in this theme. Rather, I'll let the CMS provide those for me. By the same token, the editors were saying, look, we can just have these components, these layout components, be black boxes. I don't need to be able to edit what's inside. So finding that strata or stratum of compromise is a very important concern. But the good news is that there are a lot of folks that are actually scaling this pyramid already for the marketer persona. So there's already people doing interesting work to go in this direction that will enable this richer interaction between these personas in a way that goes back to what we had before. And there's some really good examples of this that you can find on my blog. I'm not going to go through them in detail here, but they are out there. So what we really need is a new grand compromise in content management, the same compromise, the same equilibrium that we had before. And there's historical precedent for this. The Constitutional Convention back in 1787 was one of the most important events in the early history of the United States because it established this notion that, look, you're going to have to give a little. Both of you are going to have to give a little. You know, you small states that don't have a lot of people and are going to lose out on population-based representation, you will have state-based representation. But you're going to have to sacrifice the fact that it's going to be just you with all the power. And the same thing, vice versa. Those states that had that had larger populations, we would represent it based on population in the House of Representatives, but still a single entity in the Senate. It's that kind of thinking around hierarchies of needs, around compromise, around stratigraphy that we really need to isolate that single layer, that single line that we can draw across all of these different hierarchies of needs across all of our personas to understand what is the ideal CMS in today's day and age. Which brings me to my final question and sort of my final kind of ideas that I wanted to pose. I feel that we're living in two very different realities today. And you see this in the marketing and the messaging that each of these two categories of CMS are issuing. In the headless CMS messaging, you hear a lot of mentions of gobbledygook that marketers and content editors simply don't have any time to learn about. You hear a lot about JSX and MDX and ES6 and all these things that, for all intents and purposes, are gobbledygook in Greek to these marketing teams. To developers, content is no more than just data. Content is no more than APIs. But the problem is that that has never been the truth for any of the traditional CMS users that are now really struggling against this adoption of headless CMS. In the traditional CMS, content is not about data. Content is about data, but it's also about how it's presented. And we know for a fact that CMO buyers and marketing teams are not willing, they're not okay with giving up some of these key features like preview, like some of this editorial manipulation they've had before, and especially the editorial workflows that they've benefited from for the past 2 decades. So we know that neither the headless CMS model nor the traditional CMS model is the silver bullet. So what is it? What is that new CMS, and how does that look? And how does that figure into this new DXP market? We need something a little different. We need a new grand compromise. We need to go back to that era of the late 2000s and the early 2010s in spirit, where we know that we can serve all of these use cases in a very graceful way because of this balance that we've established before. But what that will require is new workflows, new approaches, new architectures, certainly, new ideas, new theories, and new approaches to how we actually solve for all of these problems. That's why in the CMS's early days, this historical precedent, developers, marketers, all these users came together to a middle ground and said, what is it that we actually really need from the CMS? And we can repair this emerging schism in terms of how differently these two groups are talking about these CMS categories by enabling both of them at the same time and considering their needs to be equally important. And so the CMS's next challenge is to restore that equilibrium that first drove it to success. That's going to be what wins the second CMS war, is getting back to that level of balance that the CMS had before. If not, we might see a permanent schism start to emerge in the CMS market. If you'd like to look at more resources, more kind of discussion around these issues, all of these blog posts go into much more detail than this presentation did about these issues. I highly encourage you to check this out. There's also one new blog post that's now available on my blog as well about some of the schism that I just mentioned at the very end. Thank you very much, and I'll take questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Preston. Thank you very much. A lot of good stuff in there. Thank you very much for finding the time, and thank you for sharing these slides and agreeing for us to record it. Let's take a few questions. I haven't received any on the chat yet, so those of you on the call, you can just go on mute and then ask away. All right, Preston, I can do one. And then people can ask on the chat as well. One thing that you mentioned was so many things, but one thing here in my note is, can you elaborate on the regrets from buying headless CMS?
Sure, absolutely. You know, one of the things that we've, well, so I won't speak to what I've seen at Oracle, but I've certainly seen this in the Drupal ecosystem. One of the things that has come about very often is two types of stories that I hear all the time, right? The first is the kind of CMO buyer that has been very convinced by the benefits of the headless CMS, rightfully so, right? The headless CMS architectures provide incredible benefits for CMOs, security, performance benefits, interactivity, in terms of enabling these really nice experiences. But what they don't provide is the level of functionality, the kind of level of fully immersed or fully ingratiated functionality that they have expected before. How do you publish content and see that get deployed out to these other applications? Without a developer at hand, you can't do it. And so what I'm seeing is a lot of this reaction first in the buyer, kind of the buying phase. So what I'm seeing first is that a lot of marketers are recoiling when they are entering into these deal conversations with headless CMSs, because they've been seeing the messaging, but the messaging doesn't match what the actual solutions for marketing teams are.
So they're kind of oversold. Yeah.
They potentially kind of oversold, you know, because this is the thing that's a big problem, right? Is that a lot of, and this is the other thing I'm seeing as well, is that a lot of these larger users or enterprise users or even small to medium businesses who actually don't have the benefit of having their own in-house developer team really suffer from this. I've heard of cases where a customer has gone and chosen the headless CMS, gotten an agency or an internal IT team to build out the entire headless CMS architecture for them. But what happens after the handoff, right? How does the editorial team now add new features that they were able to add before, add new plugins, add new modules? Now they have to call back potentially the agency, and that's not an expenditure that these CMOs are willing to pay twice. You know, they've already spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on the implementation. Why do they need to spend more on the maintenance of it? That's a really big problem for these buyers who are saying, I don't have the luxury of having a developer team that I can rely on every single day to handle these kinds of considerations.
Cool.
And the other thing I'm seeing is regrets from buyers who have bought the product, used it, worked with it, and then are now seeing those gaps surface where they're saying, yes, we understand this is better for our developers, but it's not really a better tool for us.
Cool. So let me pass it over quickly to Tony Field. Would you mind, Tony, just briefly saying hi and then asking your question?
Sure. Hi, Preston. Thanks. It's great to hear your presentation. My question is, do you see the return of legacy monolithic CMS vendors upgrading their products to live in this new world, or are you seeing more trend to rebuild from scratch? How do you see that evolving?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tony. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I say that so I'll answer this question from two different perspectives, because this whole presentation has been about two different perspectives. I'll answer it first from that kind of CMS persona angle. That's the non-developer persona. Then I'll answer it from the developer persona angle, because there's an interesting trend going on there too. So what I'm seeing right now is that there's been an initial wave of effort and endeavors to move a lot of these monolithic CMSs over to the headless CMS kind of space, in terms of what I know a lot of folks call hybrid headless. I hate the term. I don't like the term hybrid headless, but everyone loves it. So just as I didn't like the term headless CMS, I'll go along with what everyone else is saying. But hybrid headless is this idea that you can have your existing legacy CMS, your existing monolithic CMS, that handles your website concerns and your site building concerns, your visual building, all of that. But it also has APIs on top that allow for these other experiences to consume content and do all of this stuff. So that is something I'm seeing. Oracle, for example, is very much going in that hybrid headless direction. We have APIs available, but we also still have our visual builder that produces really nice websites and mobile apps within Oracle's content management system. But we're also providing really rich, amazing headless CMS capabilities that we're working very hard on right now. So Oracle is very much going in that direction. However, I've seen other firms go in that direction and then kind of retreat a little bit. So at Acquia, where I worked on Drupal, I was focused on their headless CMS strategy within Drupal. And I've seen that Drupal went very far in that direction, built a whole bunch of great APIs, did a whole bunch of great decoupled Drupal stuff, headless Drupal stuff. I wrote my book, but ever since then, because of the kind of reaction I just mentioned around people saying, wait, whoa, what's happening to all these features that are still core to my workflow? Acquia has kind of retreated from that a little bit. If you look at some of the things that they've done over the last year, they acquired a layout management company called Cohesion DX8, which is solely for that website building audience and for no one else. So it's very interesting. It's a very, very interesting trend that's going on in that space. Now, in the developer space, what's really interesting, Tony, is that there's also a little bit of monolithization happening in the developer space as well. One of the things I find really interesting is that the whole reason why people have adopted React, Vue.js, these frameworks, is because they want to go into this more headless friendly, architectural decoupling friendly direction. But the interesting thing is that actually what's happening in the last few months in the developer community is that there's now this emergence of JavaScript monoliths, which is hilarious because now we have history repeating itself constantly. There's two projects that I highly encourage you to check out, Tony. One is Inertia.js, which is intended to be a JavaScript framework that is fully integrated and plays really nicely with Laravel, which is a PHP framework. There's also another one whose name is escaping me right now, which is based on Ruby on Rails. So that's a trend that I'm watching very closely and very interested in, because maybe we're seeing a little bit of that reaction that I mentioned in the developer audience as well, where they're saying, whoa, this is way too hard. Like, the fact that these APIs are not something that I have any control over is a big issue. So